When I first moved into Riverbend Green, I was enchanted by its picturesque streets and welcoming front porches. Lush oaks and sycamores lined the sidewalks, shading rows of neat single-family homes with friendly neighbors who, at least on the surface, seemed enthusiastic about building a strong community. One detail that stood out during my initial tour with the realtor was a humble structure near the park, a large, weathered communal tool shed. According to the brochure and the realtor's promises, this shed existed for the convenience of the residents, enabling us to share rakes, shovels, gardening tools, and even a few heavier items like pressure washers. Maintenance fees for the shed were part of our monthly HOA dues. "Isn't that a thoughtful perk?" the realtor had said. At the time, I was impressed. I had grown up in a neighborhood where borrowing a lawnmower from a neighbor was a matter of knocking on their door and hoping for a friendly greeting. Here in Riverbend Green, everything seemed so well organized. The homeowners association was apparently active, but I didn't yet realize that active could also mean meddling, especially under the thumb of a particular mid-aged woman on the board. Her name was Beatrice Arnolds, though she insisted you call her Karen. Within days of settling into my new place, a cozy, two-story house with periwinkle trim, I encountered subtle hints that the HOA might be more controlling than I had anticipated. A politely stern letter from the association demanded I remove the modest windshield on my porch, as it created noise that could disturb the peace. I shrugged off the note, complying to avoid early conflict. I assumed these were just the typical quirks of an HOA, not realizing it foreshadowed bigger and stranger things to come. Still, the communal shed remained one of my favorite perks. Rather than rushing out to buy specialized tools I'd use only once a year, I could just unlock the shed, sign out what I needed, and return it later. At least, that was the theory. But soon enough, Karen would make that simple process unnecessarily complicated, setting off a bizarre power struggle that rattled the entire neighborhood. Within my first month, I heard scattered stories about Karen. A neighbor, Jack, rolled his eyes whenever her name was mentioned. "She's on the HOA board, but she acts like the entire neighborhood is her kingdom. You'll get used to it, or you'll learn to keep your head down." Another neighbor, Mrs. Davenport, recounted how Karen once measured her hedges with a tape measure to ensure they didn't exceed regulation height by even an inch. Everyone described Karen the same way: overbearing, condescending, an obsessive rule follower, except when ignoring the rules suited her own goals. Although I'd heard enough gossip to be wary, I tried to keep an open mind the first time I met her. It was during the monthly HOA gathering at the community center. Karen arrived promptly, wearing a crisp blouse and clutching a pink folder stuffed with papers. She surveyed the group like a monarch checking on her subjects. When she reached me, she smiled a tight-lipped smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Hello," she said in an almost robotic tone. "I'm Ms. Arnolds, but everyone calls me Karen. You must be new here." I introduced myself, noting how she maintained intense eye contact, as though analyzing me. She seemed to approve of the fact that I'd parted with my windshield. She told me in a patronizing tone, "You're a shining example of cooperation. Keep it up, and we'll get along just fine." Beneath her veneer of politeness, I sensed a deep need for control, like she believed she alone was responsible for upholding Riverbend Green's dignity. I walked away from that exchange feeling slightly uneasy. One thing was for sure: Karen was not someone I wanted to antagonize. Yet ironically, not long after, she would be the one antagonizing everyone over something as mundane as a tool shed lock. From the outside, the communal tool shed looked unremarkable: a solid wooden structure with a slightly sloped roof, perched on a small concrete pad beside the neighborhood's central park. The side facing the street had a large double door that swung outward, secured by a standard padlock. According to the bylaws, any resident who had paid their HOA fees in good standing could request the combination or a key. The system had changed a few times over the years to open the shed and borrow what they needed. There were also sign-in sheets on a clipboard inside to note which tools you took and when you returned them. Everything ran smoothly for years, or so I was told. A volunteer committee, just a handful of neighbors, took care of basic oversight, ensuring items were returned in decent condition. People looked out for each other. Sometimes you had to rummage a bit to find the exact shovel or rake you wanted, but nobody minded. The system encouraged a sense of community trust. When I first used the shed, about 6 weeks after moving in, I was delighted to find a top-of-the-line hedge trimmer. Checking it out was easy. I typed in the combination to open the padlock, filled out my name on the log, and walked away with the trimmer. A day later, I returned it, neat and clean. A few days afterward, however, rumors began circulating that the lock had been replaced. Some neighbors complained they no longer had the correct combination, or they discovered that their old keys didn't fit. The casual sign-out process was no longer possible. At first, I wasn't too worried. Maybe they upgraded for better security, I thought. But no official notice came from the HOA. No email, no memo, nothing in the monthly newsletter. One Saturday, I decided to check for myself. The next time I needed the shed for a simple watering can, I found the padlock indeed changed, replaced with a new brand and shape. The entire locking mechanism looked different, with a shiny silver finish. Confused, I asked around. Nobody seemed to know what had happened. Some speculated that a break-in had occurred, but if that were the case, we would have received an alert, right? Others shrugged, joking that Karen might be behind it. I laughed it off at the time, not imagining it could really be that. Then, that Monday evening, a message landed in my inbox from Karen herself. Subject, Tool Shed Protocol Update. Dear neighbors, I wanted to inform you that I have replaced the lock on the communal tool shed to ensure better oversight. Going forward, if you need access to any of the items inside, please contact me directly. I will be happy to meet you at the shed with the key on a schedule that aligns with my availability. This measure was necessary to prevent potential misuse of resources and to maintain a high standard for our community tools. Please respect this new process. Failure to comply may result in disciplinary action from the HOA. Sincerely, Karen, board member, Riverbend Green HOA. I blinked in disbelief. She had taken it upon herself to unilaterally change the lock because she wanted better oversight. And now we had to ask her for permission every time we needed a rake or a small gardening tool. This was no minor inconvenience. It was the tip of a very large iceberg. Within a day of Karen's email, the neighborhood talk boards and group texts lit up. Almost everyone was angry, some mildly irritated, others outright furious. People had grown accustomed to the freedom of retrieving tools at any time, whether early in the morning before heading to work or in the evening to finish a quick yard chore. Now, we'd be at Karen's mercy, forced to align our schedule with hers just to borrow something as simple as a broom. Lisa, a neighbor 2 houses down, wrote in the group chat, "This is ridiculous. I have 3 kids, and my free time to do yard work is often late at night or super early. Karen can't possibly meet me at 6 a.m. every time I need the weeder. She's controlling something that shouldn't be her personal fiefdom." Dan, who lived across the street, vented, "I keep my own tools, but I rely on the power washer from the shed every spring. Now, do I need a formal appointment with Karen? She can't have that kind of authority over everyone." Rumor had it Karen was keeping the single key in her kitchen drawer, refusing to cut any spares. And apparently, if you wanted to borrow a tool, you had to text or email her, describing precisely what you needed and why. If she felt the request was valid, she might schedule a time, strictly on her terms, typically during mid-morning on weekdays. People who worked a 9 to 5 had no chance. So they either had to do chores on weekends, if Karen was willing to come out, or simply give up. It was absurd. In the following days, I learned about some unsuccessful attempts to reason with Karen. A few homeowners confronted her directly, pointing out that the tool shed was a community resource and that the HOA bylaws granted all dues-paying residents the right to access it. Karen brushed off such arguments, insisting that the previous free-for-all approach was chaotic. She claimed she was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. "We must keep track of every item to prevent theft, neglect, or damage," she insisted, as if everyone else were irresponsible children. Many of us grumbled among ourselves, drafting a plan to bring this up at the next HOA board meeting. If we showed up in force, we reasoned, maybe we could pressure the board to override Karen's unilateral decision. However, some feared that the rest of the board might side with her, or at least be reluctant to challenge her. We needed to gather facts and prove that Karen had overstepped her authority, violating the official guidelines. Meanwhile, tool-based tasks across the neighborhood stalled, as no one wanted to jump through Karen's hoops just to do basic chores. A sense of resentment simmered like a pot about to boil over. 2 weeks into Karen's new lock policy, the tension escalated. More and more neighbors discovered they couldn't simply borrow a rake or a hoe without making an appointment. Karen began sending out petty reminders, scolding people for requesting the key too often or at inconvenient hours. Some neighbors attempted to approach her politely, only to receive a lecture about being respectful of her time and proving they were responsible enough to use the tools. One morning, I actually needed a simple push broom to tidy up grass clippings after mowing my front lawn. Normally, I'd have grabbed it from the shed and been done in minutes. But with the new system, I had to email Karen. She responded the next day, saying she might be available in 2 more days at 10 a.m. That was prime work time for me. I couldn't just skip a Zoom meeting to fetch a broom. By the time I could rearrange, nearly a week had passed. The clippings on my sidewalk had blown away or grown moldy in corners. It wasn't just me. Derek, an elderly resident, complained that Karen had interrogated him when he tried to borrow the stepladder to clean his gutters. She asked him if he was licensed to climb roofs, an absurd question, but apparently she was worried about liability. She refused to lend him the ladder until he provided details on exactly how he planned to use it. Derek was stunned. He'd been living there for decades, always using the communal ladder without issue. Stories like this piled up. People fumed at the monthly HOA fee that supposedly funded the communal shed, now functionally locked away at Karen's whim. A handful of folks considered purchasing duplicates of everything so they wouldn't have to deal with her. But that wasn't exactly fair. Why pay extra for items the HOA had collectively purchased? Meanwhile, Karen seemed to relish her new role as tool controller. When confronted, she'd spout lines about ensuring accountability or protecting assets. She never produced evidence that the old system was broken. No major theft had ever been reported. She simply thrived on the power of making others jump through hoops. Our frustration grew. The next HOA board meeting approached, and I started gathering all the documentation I could. The official bylaws referencing open shed access, the old sign-out sheets, and the emails she'd sent. The time had come to challenge her in a public forum. Little did I know, the confrontation would be more intense than I imagined, and the resolution oddly satisfying. The HOA board meeting that month took place in the community clubhouse, a modest building next to the Central Park. Typically, these gatherings drew maybe a dozen residents. This time, however, word spread that an important shed lock issue would be on the agenda. By the time I arrived, the place was packed. 30, maybe 40 neighbors had shown up, crowding into the folding chairs. Karen sat at the head of a long table with 4 other board members, her expression confident. The meeting covered some standard topics first: budgeting for road repairs, scheduling the annual community picnic, and finalizing the landscaping contract. Then, at last, we reached the subject that everyone was waiting for: the newly replaced tool shed lock. Mr. Brenner, the board president, an older, soft-spoken man, cleared his throat. It appears many residents have concerns about accessing the communal shed. Karen, since you made the changes, could you explain your reasoning? Karen nodded, wearing a prim smile. Of course. I replaced the lock to ensure better accountability. I noticed tools weren't always returned promptly, some items were damaged, and there was no proper tracking system. By placing the key in my custody, we can guarantee each tool is borrowed responsibly. She spoke as if this was a widely agreed-upon necessity. Around the room, neighbors exchanged scowls of disbelief. I raised my hand. When Mr. Brenner called on me, I stood up and said, with respect, Karen, we already had a sign-out sheet. People wrote down their name and unit number, so accountability was in place. I'm not aware of any widespread theft or irreparable damage. Why the drastic change? Karen frowned. I've personally seen tools left dirty or returned late. Some folks might not view that as a big deal, but it costs our HOA when equipment deteriorates prematurely. My system ensures we know exactly who has which tool, and that it's inspected before being reissued. Patty, a longtime resident sitting near the front, interjected, but you're not letting people borrow tools unless they align their schedule with yours. We can't always meet you on your timetable. It's become a huge hassle. A chorus of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's lips tightened. I'm quite flexible, she insisted. I've responded to every email with a proposed pickup time. Lisa scoffed audibly. You offered me a single 10-minute window in a week, and I had to skip a dentist appointment to get a rake. Mr. Brenner tried to restore order, tapping his gavel gently. All right, let's keep this calm. Karen, do you realize that by controlling the key, you're effectively preventing many residents from accessing a resource they pay for? The bylaws specifically mention open access. Karen's eyes flickered. The bylaws don't forbid an oversight protocol. Our highest priority is to maintain standards, and I believe this new method is the only way to secure the shed properly. At this, I pulled out a copy of the official Riverbend Green bylaws, flipping to the section about communal property usage. Section 8.2, I read aloud, states that any paying member of the HOA is entitled to self-service use of the communal tool shed. No single individual shall prevent or limit access beyond reasonable sign-out procedures or usage hours. Also, any changes to locks or mechanisms must be approved by the full board, with 30 days notice to residents. The room fell silent. Karen's face paled slightly. A few neighbors smirked. I continued. Did the board ever vote on changing the lock or altering the access procedure? Mr. Brenner exchanged a glance with the other board members. One woman, Ms. Higgins, cleared her throat. I certainly don't recall a vote. This was not on the agenda or discussed at previous meetings. Karen bristled. I took initiative. I saw a problem and acted. The board doesn't have to vote on every minor detail. The tension in the room soared. Another neighbor, Bill, chimed in. A minor detail? This has ground half the neighborhood's yard work to a halt. We can't just wait on your personal schedule to mow our lawns or fix our fences. Mr. Brenner leaned forward, brow furrowed. Karen, you can't unilaterally override the bylaws or inconvenience so many residents. That's not how this association is meant to function. Karen tried to protest, but the crowd's discontent rumbled audibly. Mr. Brenner raised a hand, calling for a formal motion. I move that we instruct Karen to restore the original lock and revert to the previous system immediately, pending any future board discussion on improved tracking. All in favor. Almost every resident in the room raised a hand. Several board members did too, though I noticed one or two who seemed reluctant, likely Karen's allies. Nonetheless, the majority was clear. Karen's shoulders tensed, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. She forced a tight nod. Fine, she said. But if the tools go missing or get damaged, don't say I didn't warn you. The room erupted in relieved chatter. People congratulated each other, feeling we'd finally regained the right to our communal resource. Yet part of me worried Karen might not back down so easily. She had a look in her eyes that hinted she might not comply without a fight. Sure enough, the next morning, I wandered over to the shed to grab a shovel, curious if the original lock was back. To my disappointment, I found the new silver padlock still in place, unchanged. I rattled it, confirming it remained firmly locked. No sign, no memo, no alternative instructions. I texted Lisa, who checked 2 hours later. Same situation. She never changed it, Lisa reported. Ugh, typical Karen. Over the next few days, no official notice went out that the lock had reverted. By the end of the week, the silver padlock was still there, effectively blocking us. Residents grew restless again. We had believed the board vote settled the matter, but apparently Karen was either ignoring the directive or stalling. At the next informal community meetup, a Saturday morning coffee gathering in the park, neighbors huddled in groups, complaining. Mr. Brenner, who attended, expressed frustration. I told Karen to restore the original lock. She claimed she was working on it. I'll follow up with her again. Another board member, Ms. Higgins, admitted she'd also reminded Karen, but Karen insisted she was waiting for the old lock mechanism to be delivered. Ms. Higgins seemed unconvinced but said there wasn't much they could do until the next official board meeting. Meanwhile, people were stuck with no easy tool access yet again. That's when I realized. Maybe Karen was stalling to see if she could sabotage the old system. Perhaps she planned to propose some compromise that kept her in control, like requiring everyone to sign out keys from her or fill out an extra form. Or maybe she hoped the problem would fade if we all gave up. But the neighborhood didn't give up. If anything, the delay fueled our resolve. A small group of residents, including me, decided to directly contact the HOA's management office, the local property management company hired to oversee finances and ensure the board followed legal guidelines. We wanted an official complaint lodged against Karen for ignoring a board directive. That Monday, we filed our complaint, attaching the meeting minutes that clearly recorded the board vote. The property manager, a pragmatic woman named Charlene, promised she'd look into it and send an official notice to Karen. If she doesn't comply, we can escalate the matter, Charlene explained. After all, the board's majority decision is binding. An individual member can't just do as they please. We left that call feeling hopeful and slightly braced for Karen's backlash once she realized we'd gone over her head. A few days after our complaint, an unexpected memo appeared on the neighborhood email list, bearing Karen's signature. The subject line read, "Important update on shed access." It was short, just a few lines. "Neighbors, I understand some of you have expressed concerns about my lock replacement. Rest assured, I am in the process of returning the old lock, but I have encountered a delay with the locksmith. As soon as the original mechanism is ready, I will restore it. In the meantime, if you need urgent access to any tools, please contact me, and I'll see what I can do. Thank you for your patience. Karen, board member, Riverbend Green HOA." The message struck us as suspiciously vague. Why would a simple reversion be so complicated? The old padlock had been perfectly functional. She could have just purchased an identical replacement at any hardware store for a few bucks. Meanwhile, "Contact me for urgent access" put us back at her mercy. Frustration peaked. Some folks posted on the neighborhood forum, demanding an immediate resolution. Others threatened to cut the lock themselves, though that risked potential accusations of vandalism. Mr. Brenner tried reasoning with Karen again, but he got nowhere. She repeated the same locksmith excuse. But within a week, Karen faced a development she probably hadn't anticipated. The HOA management office took official action. They issued her a formal notice citing that she was in violation of the board's directive and needed to comply within 5 business days or face potential penalties, including the cost of a forced removal of the lock. They also pointed out the relevant bylaw section that mandated immediate compliance with board votes. Word spread, and we waited to see how Karen would respond. That same afternoon, in what felt like an abrupt about-face, a mass email arrived in everyone's inbox. Subject: Shed lock restoration tomorrow. Dear Riverbend Green residents, after much effort, I've finally arranged for the correct parts to restore our original lock. The changeover will happen tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Please refrain from attempting to access the shed until after the work is complete. Once finished, you may resume normal usage per the old sign-out method. Regards, Karen. Victory at last. Or so it seemed. Some neighbors half expected her to sabotage the reinstallation somehow. But the next morning, a local handyman arrived with Karen in tow. By noon, the old lock, or one very similar to it, was back in place. A fresh note on the door explained that the combination, or keys, could be obtained from the management office, as was standard before. We didn't even have to see Karen's face if we didn't want to, which felt like a small blessing. A wave of relief swept the neighborhood. The fiasco was over, or so we thought. But the final chapter, involving the keys and the cost of Karen's misadventure, added one last flourish to her humiliation. While the toolshed door now had its old-style padlock, there was a catch. The neighborhood's supply of matching keys was gone. The original ones had been distributed years ago but had gradually been lost, or people had turned them in when the combination system was introduced. And the combination lock we'd had in place was gone entirely. Karen had presumably thrown it out or stashed it somewhere. So the newly installed mechanism required a fresh set of keys if folks didn't want to rely on the property manager's single master copy. That meant cutting and distributing keys to every resident in good standing, just like the bylaws promised. The cost of rekeying was not trivial. The locksmith's bill for new cores, plus duplicates of around 70 keys, added up. Typically, such an expense might be approved by the board and covered by the HOA reserve fund, but in this case, the board had not authorized the lock change at all. This was Karen's unilateral decision. At the next board meeting, Ms. Higgins put forth a motion that Karen, having acted without approval and against the bylaws, should be personally responsible for the locksmith's reinstallation fee and for producing the new keys. Why should the rest of us pay for her mistake? Ms. Higgins reasoned, garnering nods from everyone present. Karen tried to argue, saying she'd acted in good faith to protect the tools from misuse. But Mr. Brenner, the president, calmly reiterated that her lock change had been unauthorized. She'd ignored the board's directive for weeks, and the management office had to intervene. This was far beyond a minor oversight. In a heated exchange, a red-faced Karen insisted that anyone could have replaced the lock themselves if they wanted to revert it, failing to acknowledge the legal ramifications of tampering with HOA property. Another board member reminded her that the entire fiasco had cost time, energy, and created ill will in the community. The final board vote was decisive. Karen must foot the locksmith bill for the second lock replacement and cover the cost of new keys for all residents requesting them. That meant hundreds of dollars, maybe more, straight from Karen's pocket. The expression on her face was a mixture of disbelief and outrage, but she couldn't do much. The board decision stood. She had lost. In the aftermath, Karen's influence within the HOA waned drastically. She had spent years posturing as the voice of standards and compliance, but now many neighbors saw her for what she was, a control-obsessed individual who'd manipulated the system for personal power. The humiliating outcome, being forced to pay for the second lock and new keys, broke whatever spell she'd cast over her handful of supporters. At the very next board meeting, Karen announced she was taking a step back from direct oversight roles, resigning from certain committees, particularly the one overseeing communal property, which included the tool shed. She remained on the board in a nominal capacity, but her day-to-day involvement virtually disappeared. A new volunteer stepped up to handle the sign-out sheets for the shed, implementing a straightforward process that was actually simpler than the old one. People embraced it without complaint. Privately, some neighbors speculated that Karen's resignation was her way of nursing her wounds while avoiding the possibility of a complete removal vote. Others thought she might be waiting for a chance to bounce back. But for now, her iron grip on the tool shed was officially over. The immediate effect on the community was tangible: relief. At last, we could return to the tool shed whenever we wanted, with a simple sign-in procedure and a universal key that we could pick up or replicate easily. No more bowing to Karen's schedule. No more fear that borrowing a ladder would spark an inquisition about safety protocols. Everyone was free to handle their yard work, home projects, and general maintenance at their own pace. With Karen sidelined, Riverbend Green's sense of community seemed to rebound. Neighbors resumed normal routines, occasionally joking about the lockdown incident. Derek got his stepladder without any fuss. Lisa borrowed the weeder at 6 a.m. whenever she pleased. Bill used the pressure washer for his siding. I grabbed a simple broom after mowing. Life moved on smoothly, as it always should have. A few times, Karen would pass by the shed while I was there, rummaging for a tool. She'd purse her lips, shoot me a withering glance, and hurry on. I knew she still felt outraged that her grand plan to impose strict oversight had been thwarted so decisively. Yet she had no basis for complaint now that she'd been overruled by both the board and the property management office. Eventually, the old conversation about whether some tools were occasionally returned in less than perfect condition resumed, but we had a better solution: a rotating volunteer committee that did a monthly check on the shed. We vacuumed out leaves, made sure everything was in the right place, and wrote up a short status report for the HOA. This decentralized approach, neighbors helping neighbors, worked wonderfully. It was precisely what a communal tool resource was meant for. On a more personal level, I realized that the lockdown incident had actually fostered a closer bond among many of us. Through our joint effort to stand up to Karen's overreach, I'd gotten to know folks I otherwise might have only passed with a wave. We learned that while an HOA can be beneficial for handling shared expenses and amenities, it requires vigilance so that no single individual can hijack the system. Power, left unchecked, can become a tool of oppression over something as mundane as a shovel or a weed whacker. Though Karen no longer controlled the shed, she didn't fade away entirely. She still lived in Riverbend Green, of course, and still held a seat on the board, even if it was largely symbolic. Occasionally, we'd see glimpses of her meddlesome streak in other areas, like complaining about holiday decorations that extended beyond a front porch or sending notes about minor noise violations. But the broader community had learned a lesson. We no longer let her edicts go unchallenged. Whenever Karen tried to push something questionable, a group of neighbors would show up at the board meeting with bylaws in hand. We reminded everyone that no personal agenda should override the official process. The fiasco with the shed had taught us how to read the rules, gather the facts, and speak with a united voice. The result was that Karen's future attempts at power grabs met with immediate pushback. As for the tool shed, it remained a shining example of neighborly cooperation. We stocked it with a few new items donated by those who felt the shed had proven its worth: a pruning saw, an edger, extra extension cords. Whenever you borrowed a tool, you wrote your name down, and that was that. No stress, no intrusion, just people making good on the promise of a helpful, community-minded resource. I'd see neighbors come by sometimes for a random item and feel a swell of quiet pride that we'd taken a stand to keep it open and accessible. Meanwhile, Karen would sometimes watch from her window, expression inscrutable. Perhaps she was stewing over her downfall, or maybe she'd convinced herself she was still in the right. It no longer mattered, because the lock fiasco had ended with a clear victory for the rest of us. Over the next year, Riverbend Green experienced a wave of renewed community initiatives: gardening clubs, block parties, group volunteer sessions to repaint the park benches. That old sense of camaraderie that first drew me to the neighborhood flourished. Interestingly, the tool shed itself became a gathering point for neighbors to chat, exchange tips on yard care, or just catch up. The monthly shed committee check turned into a social affair. We'd show up with coffee, inspect the tools, crack jokes about how a 15-year-old hedge trimmer was still going strong. People donated old but functional gear, expanding the shed's offerings. The place that Karen had tried to monopolize now stood as a testament to cooperation. For me, personally, that first major clash with Karen taught me a valuable lesson about living under an HOA. Not all associations are bad or dictatorial. Most serve legitimate purposes, but they can become breeding grounds for power-hungry personalities if the community isn't vigilant. Thanks to that ordeal, we remained vigilant. None of us would let another Karen situation develop unchecked. I'd often recall the day we discovered the newly swapped silver lock. So simple a change, but so telling of how far a single board member would go to assert control. In the end, the resolution hinged on unity: neighbors who refused to bow to arbitrary demands, a board that recognized the majority's voice, and a property management office that enforced the bylaws impartially. And Karen, ironically, had united us all by pushing her luck too far. She became a cautionary tale. If you attempt to seize communal property for personal power, you risk not only your standing but also your wallet, since she'd had to reimburse the entire cost of rekeying the shed. One sunny Saturday about 18 months after the fiasco, I found myself standing by the communal shed, rummaging for a small cultivator to loosen the soil around my newly planted rose bushes. I breathed in the spring air, smiling as I recalled how different life had been before we'd reclaimed this space. Lisa ambled over to borrow the same push broom I'd needed that one day, back when we had to beg Karen for access. We exchanged a look of amusement, remembering how we'd once felt so powerless. Now, we just grabbed what we wanted without a second thought. Over Lisa's shoulder, I spotted Derek offering to help Bill with some painting supplies. A sense of warmth spread through me. This was what community was all about. From across the street, Karen passed by in her SUV, eyes flicking toward the shed. For a moment, our gazes met. Her face betrayed no clear emotion, but I detected a flicker of something: resignation, perhaps, or acceptance that her lock-swapping reign was long over. She drove away without a word. I shrugged, grabbing the cultivator and shutting the door behind me, snapping the simple, user-friendly padlock back into place. As I walked home, the bright afternoon sun sparkled on the newly trimmed lawns, the well-tended flower beds, and the cheerful chatter of neighbors out walking their dogs or watering their gardens. I realized that, ironically, we owed a measure of gratitude to Karen. By going too far, she reminded us that our real strength lay in working together, standing firm for what was rightfully ours. She made us appreciate the freedoms and communal trust we might otherwise have taken for granted. And so, life continued in Riverbend Green, with the shared shed standing as a triumphant symbol of neighborly collaboration. Karen had tried to hold the key, literally and figuratively, but the community refused to accept her lock on our resources. We restored open access, and in doing so, reaffirmed that we were more than a collection of houses under an HOA. We were a neighborhood bound by the simple, powerful principle that shared property belongs to everyone, not just one self-appointed gatekeeper.